I enjoy that Q&A time that we share together. So after this part one presentation on Elliot J. Wagner, I'll look forward to your questions. And then, as Ken mentioned, I do indeed have some ideas that I'll pass to you on a sheet of paper about an Adventist history tour in Michigan. Some of you, at least 6 from the Holland Church, have gone to New England with me, and we've made that trip twice. Not many do Michigan Adventist Heritage trips. I know Dr. Merlin Burt has at Andrews. So I'm looking forward to the challenge and the opportunity that this will bring for me to lead one. So while we're talking about Wagner, I'd like to pass this book around so that you've got some pictures to look at. I know you already own that book, Jim. But some of the pictures of the Wagner family. This is Elliot J. Wagner, from physician of good news to agent of division. If you've been following a pattern of my presentations, all the pioneers I've shared with you so far have ended well. I'm tipping you off. Elliot J. Wagner does not end well. He begins well, but he ends badly, okay? And I think there are several lessons that we can learn from that, because some of our lives today don't always end well either. So let me raise the question I always raise in part one of every presentation. Why should we today study the life of Elliot J. Wagner? I can think of several reasons why the shadow of this tiny man hovers over your life and mine in the 21st century. And by the way, when I say tiny man, as far as I know, he was the shortest of our pioneers, 5 feet 1 inch. All right, so he's a little leprechaun of a character. Every one of you is taller than E.J. Wagner was. 5 feet 1 inch tall. And of course, Ellen White comes in at 5 feet 2 inches. John Harvey Kellogg comes in at 5 feet 3 inches. J.N. Loughborough comes in at 5 feet 4 inches. So the pioneers projected long shadows, but they were fairly short in many cases. That's your trivia for today. On the positive side, Elder Wagner made significant theological contributions to Seventh-day Adventism, not the least of which was his emphasis on the glad tidings, righteousness by faith through Christ, and Christ's righteousness dwelling within us at a time in our church's history when legalism was choking the spiritual breath out of the church. But on the negative side, I believe we can learn some lessons from his failures. His emphasis on panentheism, his focus on spiritual affinities, his opposition to church reorganization, 1901, 1903, his ignoring counsels from Ellen White that he didn't like, and his perilous slide into adultery near the end of his career. So I'm just kind of giving you a forewarning, a foreshadowing, as they say in literature, of some of the good and some of the bad things that are coming in this 4-part series. Elliot J. Wagner came into this world on January 12, 1855, in Waukau, Wisconsin, the 6th of 10 children, born to Joseph H. Wagner, an Adventist preacher, and Marietta Hall Wagner. When Joseph, a former Baptist, accepted the Seventh-day Adventist message in 1852, he immediately threw his last wad of tobacco into the stove and never smoked again. We call that cold turkey. No patch, no electric cigarette, cold turkey. Joseph's talents and zeal for the truth would eventually lead him to become an evangelist, a writer, a theologian, an editor, a revivalist, a health reformer, an administrator, an overseas missionary, and a member of the General Conference Committee. Well, in 1855, Joseph and Marietta moved the family to Saline, Michigan, to be closer to the new church headquarters, which, as you know, was at Battle Creek. There, amidst grinding poverty. Now, we have to remember, our preachers didn't receive any salary at all before 1859 and the establishment of the systematic benevolence plan. They depended on gifts from people as they preached and traveled. Amidst this grinding poverty, they experienced many tragedies. Within 3 years, they lost 2 children. Eventually, 4 of their 10 children would die. Now, this was not an unusual event in those pioneer days, when up to half of one's progeny could lose their lives before reaching adulthood. Tragedy that you and I don't have to face today. So poor were the Wagners that when they moved to Burlington, Michigan in 1858, the believers there raised $125 to build them a house where they would live for the next 40 years. But all was not well spiritually in the Wagner household. On May 14, 1861, Marietta Wagner sent a stunning confession to the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. She described herself as a thorn in my husband's flesh and a reproach to the Lord's cause for years. I am ashamed of the way I have treated those who wanted to be my friends, she wrote. I have resolved to amend in the future. And yet she also worried in this letter that I have rejected counsel and grieved the Holy Spirit till God has taken it from me. Apparently, one reason for her low spiritual state was the fact that she had rejected some of Ellen White's testimonies regarding her husband's duties as a minister of the gospel. And so now she wrote, I am now willing that my husband should labor in the message when and where duty calls. The larger context for this amazing letter reveals that Mrs. Wagner was under terrible stress due to the family's poverty, frequent illness, frequent moves, and Joseph, her husband's, absences from home. Her stress was no doubt exacerbated by Ellen White's April 1860 testimony rebuking both parents for not properly disciplining their children, including Ellen. You remember when I shared with you the story of Uriah Smith. A similar testimony from Ellen White came to Uriah and Harriet about the way they were raising their sons. Later, during the 1870s, Mrs. White would rebuke Joseph for his disobedient neglect of her warnings, as well as his spirit of self-reliance, his impulsiveness, and occasionally his severity with church members. In an 1872 testimony, she also rebuked Marietta for her whining, groaning, and seeking sympathy from others. And then she hinted, in a typically oblique Victorian manner, that Marietta's immoral behavior bordered on adultery, and if she continued in that path, could lead to divorce. Now, I share these details with you for 2 reasons. First, I believe the dysfunctional family in which Elliot Wagner grew up greatly shaped his attitudes and his behavior later in life, and might, at least in part, explain why some of his actions later on in life mirrored those of his mother and father. What do we say about the apple? It doesn't fall far from the tree, right? Okay. I think we're going to see that in parts 2 and 3 and 4. Throughout his life, Elliot Wagner would demonstrate a lack of self-discipline. a bent toward trifling conversation, an inability to accept responsibility or bear spiritual burdens, and a lack of dignity for a minister of the gospel. As we will see, his parents' negative response to Ellen White's advice later shaped Ellet's views of the Lord's messenger. He either refused to accept some of her counsel, he neglected most of it, or he dragged his feet in obeying it. And once again, we see a pattern here from a former pioneer I shared with you, Uriah Smith, right? Uriah and Herod, same thing. His particular rejection of her warnings concerning his relationship with Edith Adams would bring disastrous results for the whole family. You're going to have to wait till part 4 for that one. On the positive side, however, Ellet's theological mindset was shaped by his father Joseph's interpretation of the law in Galatians, his health reform practices, his efforts to promote church organization, his warnings about the dangers of spiritualism, his emphasis on religious liberty, and his focus on justification by faith in his articles and books. So in these areas, I think we're going to see the son, Ellet J. Wagner, patterning himself after his father, Joseph. A second reason for sharing these rather unsavory details is that it helps us to understand why Joseph and Marietta may have chosen to send Ellet and his sister Ruby to live with the Lindsays, solid Seventh-day Adventist friends who lived in upstate New York. There, Ellet attended the elementary school in Lockport, which was a stone's throw from the Erie Canal. He also worked on Charles Lindsay's farm in Burt to pay for his board and room. But in 1874, when Ellet turned 19, the Lindsays sent him to the newly established Battle Creek College, where he became close friends with Willie White, who was about the same age. There, Ellet majored in the classical course. In other words, he studied Greek and Latin and ancient history. A bright and serious scholar, he also joined Fide Dilectation, the men's literary society, where he honed his skills at debating. And as we've shared with you in other presentations, Adventist ministers love to debate. I don't see your pastor seeking debates with the Methodists and the Baptists in town, but 100 years, 150 years ago, that's what our Adventist evangelists did. So being a good debater was a plus for an Adventist minister. In one famous debate, Ellet Wagner was a member of the team that argued that the achievements of the ancient Greeks and Romans surpassed the accomplishments of modern civilizations. In addition to his coursework at the college, Ellet also prepared himself for entrance into medical school by taking tutorial classes with John Harvey Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. In the fall of 1875, Ellet entered the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which had just started a medical course. And there he took medical training. The school records, however, show he did not finish the medical course in Ann Arbor. Instead, he moved to Brooklyn in 1876 to attend the Long Island College Hospital Medical Training Program. And that is still going today. It's part of the State University of New York College of Medicine there. It's in New York City. 2 years later, in 1878, he completed his MD degree. Believing that medicine might be his calling, Dr. Wagner hung up his shingle in Battle Creek and began practicing general medicine with a colleague, Dr. Green. But he spent his leisure time courting a 19-year-old beauty named Jessie Fremont Mosier from Iowa. And they were married on March 30, 1879 in Sigourney, Iowa. Now, marriage changed not only Dr. Wagner's social status, but also his career path, at least temporarily. Instead of practicing medicine out there in Iowa, Ellett turned to public evangelism. He teamed up with Elder Ira J. Hankins and his wife to hold tent meetings across the state of Iowa in 1879 and 1880. But in the summer of 1880, he accepted an invitation to be a resident physician at the recently opened sanitarium in St. Helena, California. Well, attending the Healdsburg, California camp meeting in October of 1882, Dr. Wagner had a life-changing experience. We might today call it an epiphany or a conversion experience. Let me quote his words. He said, "Suddenly a light shone about me, and the tent seemed illuminated. I saw Christ crucified for me, and to me was revealed for the first time in my life the fact that God loved me. And to me, he had died and given himself on the cross." In short, like so many second, third, and fourth generation Adventists in the baby boomer generation today, who grew up religious but perhaps not spiritual, Ellett experienced a genuine spiritual conversion at the age of 27. This deep, almost visionary experience changed his total perspective on Seventh-day Adventism, altered the trajectory of his life. He resolved to devote his life to full-time gospel ministry. Now, this result at first led him into the publishing ministry. In the spring of 1883, he joined his father, Joseph, in Oakland, California. Joseph, at that time, was the editor of our one West Coast paper, The Signs of the Times. And so Ellett became his assistant editor. But he grew tired of setting type and proofreading copy. And so that fall, Ellett teamed up with Elder W.C. Granger to engage in public evangelism. But not content with a single occupation, between 1883 and 1890, Dr. Wagner would also pastor the Oakland Seventh-day Adventist Church, teach religion courses at Healdsburg College, the forerunner of what today is Pacific Union College, and travel extensively on the speaking circuit to camp meetings and conference gatherings. He never just did one thing. He was kind of what we call today a multitasking individual. Meanwhile, his wife Jessie worked as a proofreader at Pacific Press for $9 a week. And that week, of course, was a 6-day, 60 hours labor at $1.50 a day. Now, unlike his legalistic ministerial colleagues, Ellett Wagner's public sermons and his published articles had a decidedly Christ-centered message at their core. While other preachers focused on obedience to God's law, Ellett Wagner emphasized God's forgiving grace. Soon, church leaders began taking notice of this rising star. At both the General Conference sessions of 1886 in Battle Creek and 1887 in Oakland, California, he was elected to serve on the important Resolutions Committee that processed all the motions that were made on the floor for action. In addition, he was appointed to the Book Committee and to the International Sabbath School Association. And his wife Jessie was asked to be the corresponding secretary of the International Sabbath School Association. That's the person that writes all the letters and responds to all the letters that believers write into the headquarters. Subsequently, officials of the California Conference asked Wagner to speak for the upcoming week of prayer. At several public venues, Ellett and another rising star named Alonzo Trevier Jones, I think we'll do him next. You know, the two are kind of like Bobbsey twins, Wagner and Jones, addressed the growing threat of Sunday blue laws being sponsored by the National Reform Association. So you see, In the 19th century, when you saw the abbreviation NRA, you didn't think of the National Rifle Association. You thought the National Reform Association. And they're the ones that are pushing for a national Sunday blue law. On the home front, Jesse and Elliot, at least during the 1880s, appeared to be living in marital bliss. In rapid succession, they had 3 children, 2 daughters, Bessie and Pearl, and a son, Ernest, who unfortunately died at 9 months of age. From snippets shared years later by both of the girls, we know that Elliot was a doting father. He read exciting storybooks and even fairy tales to the girls. He sang simple songs with them. He helped them learn Bible verses, and he rocked them to sleep at night. Unfortunately, a smoky stove in their house clouded little Bessie's eyesight early on and forced her to wear glasses for the rest of her life. Despite his constant physical and mental activity, Dr. Wagner himself was not free from afflictions. In 1886, at only 31, he contracted what they called in the 19th century brain fever. My best guess, if there are any nurses in the audience, probably today we would say encephalitis or meningitis, brain fever. Undoubtedly, his penchant for overwork harmed his physical health. Elliot was what we today would call a prodigious multitasker. He loved to have many irons in the fire at the same time and to be accomplishing several tasks, such as the curse of those who are type A's and choleric in temperament. A close reading of Elder Wagner's articles and sermons between 1875 and 1888 reveals several interesting traits about his religious and spiritual mindset prior to the General Conference session at Minneapolis. First, his messages are Christocentric. That is, they all focus on Jesus Christ and his righteousness. Second, they often emphasize justification by faith through Christ and sanctification by faith through Christ. Third, he also devotes a great deal of attention to what he calls perfecting grace, how the saving grace of Jesus within the believer's heart leads to victory over sin. Fourth, unlike other Adventist ministers and writers, Elder Wagner gives far less attention to theology and doctrines and far more attention to the life, death, resurrection of Christ. Fifth, his research into the Old and New Covenants advanced Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the various covenants mentioned in the Bible, both in the Old and in the New Testaments. Sixth, Wagner also loved to write about the 2 natures of Christ, the human and the divine, and how they were distinct and yet blended. According to his biographer, Dr. Woodrow Whidden, and it is his book that's making the rounds here, Wagner is also the spring from which flowed the so-called last generation theology that is so prevalent among some in our church today. That is, that before Christ returns to this earth, there must be a generation of Christians who live sinless lives that fully reflect the character of Christ. But Dr. Wagner did not devote all his time and energy to writing on theological topics. He also spoke out against the social injustices he saw in the United States. As a citizen living in the state of California, he was in a prime position to see the racial injustice all around him, especially in the hatred manifested toward the Chinese and the Japanese immigrants who picked the fruit and vegetable crops in that state. During the 1880s, you remember your American history, harsh laws were passed by the West Coast states, California, Oregon, Washington, that sought to restrict or block further immigration of Asians to the United States. Also, unlike most Adventists at the time, Dr. Wagner was not a conscientious objector. He was a pacifist. In other words, he took the same position as the Quakers or Friends take then and now. Therefore, he spoke and wrote against the evils of war as a violation of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. For him, there was no such thing as a just war or a defensive war. All wars were evil. On the positive side, as we will see a bit later, Elliot Wagner and his friend Alonzo Jones would both write and speak boldly on behalf of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, not only in California, but all across the United States. As we will see in part 2, these two men would also start a new magazine. At first it was called the Adventist Sentinel, and then it was called the Sabbath Sentinel, then the Sentinel, and then, as we know it today, Liberty Magazine, to promote these causes nationally and internationally. Finally, given the key roles that Wagner and Jones played at the 1888 General Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I think it behooves us at this point to examine exactly what Elder Wagner believed and taught prior to going to the General Conference of 1888, so we can clearly distinguish his pre-1888 theology from his post-1888 aberrations. Okay? First of all, according to Woody Widnow, Wagner clearly taught that Christ bore the penalty of sin for us as the sacrificial substitute to satisfy the demands of God's broken Ten Commandment law. Second, we know that he taught that Christ's high priestly intercession in the heavenly sanctuary had atoning significance for all faithful believers here on earth. Third, that when he came to this earth, Christ bore all the weaknesses, passions, and tendencies of sinful flesh passed down to him by thousands of years of sinful ancestors. Fourth, he taught that the law in the book of Galatians was the moral or Ten Commandment law, not the Mosaic or ceremonial law, which Uriah Smith and George I. Butler and J.H. Morrison and others were teaching at that time. Fifth, he believed that true sanctification through Christ leads the believer on to perfection in Christ, meaning that we can overcome all known sin in our lives in this world prior to Christ's second coming. See, this is part of the basis of the last generation theology teaching. Because many of Elder Wagner's views on these topics would undergo a significant paradigm shift during the 1890s, it is important for us to know exactly what he believed in 1888 when he and A.T. Jones received the unequivocal endorsement of Ellen White herself. And so next time, November, right? Coming back in November or October? October, all right, October. When we do part 2, we will examine in greater detail the roles played by E.J. Wagner and A.T. Jones at the 1888 General Conference session. Also in part 2, we will highlight 7 factors that poisoned the atmosphere in Minneapolis. We will look at the key players and what the major controversies were in 1888. And then we will spend some time discussing the aftershocks of 1888. And then we'll close by taking a look at the wider national impact of Wagner's ministry between 1888 and 1891 and his contributions that he made in England, because he was one of our early missionaries to England as well. So that's part 1, the early years of E.J. Wagner. And now I'm happy to entertain any questions that you have. You want to pull out that long list that you've been accumulating over the past, how long has it been, Jim? Is it 5 months, 6 months? I was here this spring, earlier this spring, but many of you in the night season when you couldn't sleep, why, you thought of questions for this hour. So I'm happy to open up the floor, and then we'll talk about an Adventist heritage trip that I am going to suggest we take. Oh, yes. No, I didn't. And I'm not sure we know exactly that date. Probably around the age of 12, 13. I mean, he's a preacher's kid, so he grew up as an Adventist. So I would presume probably an early teenage, adolescent. I would guess so, yeah. Yeah, after they moved to Battle Creek in 1855. Yeah. Most of the second generation Adventists, the children of Adventist pioneers would typically get baptized around 11, 12, 13, 14. Because they'd been raised in this message, I didn't specifically mention how old he was when he was married, but we can do the math. I gave you a date of 1879, subtract 1855, 24. 24. Same age my father was when he got married. I'm not hearing you. Yeah. That was considered old enough for a woman. Women often got married at 16. And the farther south you go, the younger they got married. Down in Dixie, they could marry at 12, according to state law. 12, 13. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, I'm sure it was. I mean, the average life expectancy at that time would be in the 40s. 45 or so. Yes, we have pioneers living on into their 80s. We did John Byington, 87 years of age. Ellen White, 88 almost. But, there's a lot of babies that die, too. So you got to average out the older ages with the infant deaths. And also the women, the mothers that die in childbirth. That was a key killer of women, was just bearing children. And because so many children died, 20%, 30s, 40%, they would have large families. Even into the early 20th century. I mean, my mother came from a family of 8 children. My father came from a family of 10 children. They decided to stop after 3. And all 3 of us are still living. But, my father's family lost one of those 10 children. All right, yes, sir. That is a good question. And Woody Whidden is a theologian. One of the beefs I have with his biography is that he puts so much emphasis on E.J. Wagner, the theologian, and not enough on Dr. E.J. Wagner, the physician. I don't think the fact that his career as a medical doctor was so short would have much to tell us about whether he was a poor physician or not. It's just he felt a call from God for the gospel ministry, and so he decided to switch over to that. But I think the fact that he took a year at the University of Michigan, which is quite prestigious, and then went to New York City to finish his MD, would indicate he had a very good medical education. So I would guess that professionally speaking, he was probably a pretty skilled physician. But, you know, I would like to know, yeah, like you do, how good was he at it? What was his attitude toward being a physician? Where did he practice medicine? What kinds of, you know, medical practices, pills, so forth did he give out and dispense? And we don't have that information. Apparently, his medical career was only a few years, you know, 3, 4, maybe 5. And he decided after that conversion experience at 27 that the gospel ministry was his calling. And he probably felt just devastated, you know, the fact that he couldn't save his 9-month-old baby son. But that was fairly common. Lots of babies died in those days. Any from this side of the house? We're not all sleeping, are we, over here? Listening. Yes. If E.J. Wagner followed the path that John Harvey Kellogg followed, and one would assume he did since he took classes from John Harvey Kellogg, then his path would be natural remedies, hydrotherapy treatments, you know, the hot and the cold baths and the sitz baths and the sprays and all of that, and not the bloodletting and the drugs that conventional physicians went in for. I don't know that Wagner did surgery. That's another good question we don't know the answer to. John Harvey Kellogg, of course, was very successful at it. He had several hundred surgeries without a single fatality, which was thought to be nothing short of a miracle. You know, here he is going through, I don't remember the exact number, 600 or 700 surgeries, Swartz tells us, without a single patient dying. And that was in an era when 1 out of 8 or 9 deaths after surgery was thought to be. That's acceptable. Yeah. But he prayed, I'm talking about Kellogg now, he prayed before every surgery. And he used warm sandbags after surgery. And of course, he fed the patients a good diet, good vegetarian diet. And he got them doing bed exercises and so forth. So if Elliot Wagner followed John Harvey Kellogg's teaching, then he was on the right track as far as natural remedies, hydrotherapy, all of that. Other doctors were bloodletting and drugging and oh, you could get opium at the local drugstore. Yeah. It was flavored and put in a very attractive little bottle, and it was called Mother's Little Helper because it quieted the colicky babies. Oh, yeah, it did. Knocked them right out. Mother's Little Helper. Opium. You could get morphine at the local drugstore. Ipecac. Marijuana. Yeah. At the local drugstore for a few pennies. Yes? Well, you're anticipating part 3 and 4. Oh, you don't know if you're going to be here then. Well, yeah. Yeah. Oh, don't we all? Well, um, just a quick sneak peek at parts 3 and 4. For Wagner, spiritual affinities got him into trouble. That is the belief that though he and others could be married to one spouse here on this earth, that might not be God's choice for them in heaven. And so they could have affinities with other women that are not their wives, but might become their wives in heaven. And that led him down the slippery slope into adultery. And the woman he committed adultery with was Edith Adams. And we'll be dealing with her in part 4. And it was a shameful blotch upon his career and an embarrassment to the church. But he caused that problem. That's not God's fault. He caused that problem. Because spiritual affinities fit what he wanted to do with his private life. There were some problems in the marriage. And I would say most of the fault for that was on E.J. Wagner's part, but there were some dysfunctional problems in the Wagner family that I will develop in part 3 and part 4. And it all led to a very slippery slope down the path toward adultery. As far as H.E. Jones goes, since you mentioned his name, I think we'll do him next. Jones was, if you want a really big word to mull over in your mind this week, he was an anti-establishmentarian. He didn't like church organization. He didn't like hierarchies. He didn't like presidents over the GC and over unions and conferences and so forth. His feeling was that the church should stay at the congregational level. Nothing higher than local congregation. Well, you know, that's where the early 19th century Christian connection was. That's where the early Adventist Christians were. And there's no future as far as the three angels' messages go, because you don't have a mission. You don't have a worldwide mission if you're going to stay at the local congregational level. But Jones was very much anti-organization. Now that got him into serious trouble in 1901, 1903 with the reorganization movement in the church. So he left the church basically over that. But I would say in a nutshell, both men caused their own problems. They made their bed and they had to lie in it, as we say. And it wasn't God's fault. So you can be correct up here and not correct here. Because both men tended to follow their feelings, their emotions. And Ellen White had to deal with that even in 1888. We'll find in part 2, she's telling him, you're too harsh. You're too judgmental. You're too condemnatory. You need to have more grace. You need to show more love. You need to show more kindness in your discourse. And this led both men to kind of reject what Ellen White had to tell them because it wasn't very pleasing to them. And we've seen in other pioneer pathways when they reject the counsels of Ellen White, they often don't end up very well in the end. So I suppose that's a question that you'll have to ask our Heavenly Father, why he chose those two. Because if he sees the end from the beginning, and we believe he does, he knew how they were going to end. But then he knew how Saul was going to end. He knew how David was going to get into immoral problems too. And yet he selected David as king, selected Saul as king. Yeah. Jim. Yes, 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 yes. They don't all end well, do they? Yeah, yeah, right. The freedom of choice. Any other question? Yes, sir. At the end of the 19th century, you're saying? The end of the 1800s? Yeah. Mhm. Um, she, as you know, she uses the word power, kingly power, and she rebukes that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in our church. Um, the reference to the papacy, Catholicism, that sort of thing, I think you'll find that more in A.T. Jones' writings rather than in E.J. Wagner's writings. A.T. Jones, the one who's the anti-establishmentarian, sees hierarchies and power pyramids in terms of yeah, Catholic hierarchies, papacy, papal power, that sort of thing, and feels that by appointing A.G. Daniels as president of the General Conference, we're headed in that direction, he felt. He had no objection, I guess, to calling A.G. Daniels the chair of the committee of the General Conference, which A.G. Daniels did try for 1 year. But it didn't work because so many legal forms had to be signed by the president of the church. And so, you know, there was no place for a chair of a committee to sign, you know, a legal form. It had to be a president. But A.T. Jones, I think, you know, you'll find him more often referring to papal power and Catholicism than you would E.J. Wagner. Yes, isn't that ironic? Yes, yes. I think that was 1903, 1904. So it was just after the Reorganization General Conference. He accepts the presidency of the California Conference, which is kind of, you know, a real irony, almost bordering on hypocrisy, based on what he thought about, you know, church leadership, that he accepts the presidency of the California Conference. He wasn't very successful at it. It really was a failure on his part. He did some good things. I will point out some of the good things he did in Part 4, but he wasn't what we would call a team player. He wasn't a good committee-type man. He wasn't a very cooperative kind of fellow. You know, he tended to be a little bit more strong-armed and even dictatorial in some ways. So it's very ironic that he did accept that position. It only lasted 1 year. I think the Californians were glad to get rid of him at the end of the year. Yeah, I'm referring to that. I know we often use that term, but technically speaking, Wagner was more a panentheist. A pantheist is someone who sees trees and flowers and grass and food as God. All right? God is the tree. God is the flower. God is the food. A panentheist, on the other hand, is someone who sees God in that flower, in that tree, in that grass, in that food. And so we'll be coming to that in somewhat more detail when we get there. But I know we tend to use pantheism rather than panentheism. A philosopher would probably disagree with us on that. But at any rate, both teachings compromise the personal nature of God. They make God into an influence or a force rather than a person, a being, a divine being. All right, Jim, you want to be helpful? You always want to be helpful, don't you? Let's pass these out, okay? One per family. Another question? Well, they both have problematic relations with Ellen White. I've just mentioned briefly some of the problems the Wagner family had when Ellen White rebuked them with regards to their raising of children. A.T. Jones, of course, is going to cross paths with Ellen White over a number of issues because he's very strong on religious liberty. And while he feels that we ought to pay our taxes, he also feels very strongly that Adventists ought not to vote at all on any issue. They ought not to hold any public office at any level. We ought not to accept any gifts from a government, land, money, whatever. And so when Cecil Rhodes offers to give us thousands of acres in Africa, Jones says, no, we can't accept that. Ellen says, why? You know, why can't we accept that? See, A.T. Jones sees Cecil Rhodes, who was head of the land company, as a representative of the British government, but he's not. He's an independent businessman. And Ellen White said, God's moving on his heart to be generous here. So we should accept this land, and on that land, as you know, the Seleuci mission was established in South Africa. And she saw no problem with that. That was not mixing church and state. Cecil Rhodes was not the state. He was representing a land company. So do return for parts 2, 3, and 4. We'll be going into more detail on some of the clashes that these men had with Ellen White and her testimonies. All right, little background here. We've had 2 tours to New England, and they were fun, weren't they? But no tours to Michigan. And here we've got all this Adventist history in our own backyard, so to speak. I know Dr. Merlin Burt has led his seminary classes on tours of Michigan. I went on a tour of Michigan with Jim Nix many years ago, but not many are doing Michigan tours. And so Jesse and Susan Landis, and the 4 of you that went on our tour last year know they are the managers of the tour, and I have decided that we should do one here in Michigan because there are many Adventist sites that most of us haven't seen. And so that's the plan for September of 2020, almost exactly 1 year from now. So start setting aside the funds, all right, in your weekly allowance, okay? Jesse is estimating this would be a 6-day tour and could probably be done for about half the cost of last year's tour. Last year's tour was about $1,000 per person. Of course, we were going way up into New England, and he thinks probably about $500, which is really, really cheap. That's about $80 a day. As I mentioned to you a couple years ago, when I retired from teaching 3.5 years ago, I really splurged. I felt 42 years of Adventist salary. I was going to celebrate with a big bang. And so I took a luxury tour, a riverboat tour in Central Europe for 14 days for $7,000. And that was $500 a day. This is $500 for the whole shebang, okay? Keep that perspective in mind. Yes, I had gourmet food. Yes, I had deluxe accommodations in motels and on the boat. Yes, it was the best of the best with Uniworld travel tours, and they're right up there next to Viking. But we're going to take you on an efficiency, nice and clean, good and wholesome tour with a chartered bus, with Wi-Fi, no leaky compartments, air conditioning, PA system, bathroom in the back for $500. That's what Jesse's estimating. So I've just put them here in alphabetical order. We won't be able to go to all 70 sites, but Jesse asked me to suggest some. So let's start with Allegan, which isn't too far away. There's the Allegan Seventh-day Adventist Church, dedicated by J. N. Andrews, 1864. And right nearby is the river, that's the Kalamazoo, right? Yeah. Kalamazoo River, where Edson White launched the Morning Star boat that eventually made its way to Chicago and down the Mississippi River, all right? So there's, you know, a couple of things to see in Allegan. Battle Creek, most of you have been there. But even historic Adventist Village, there's always something new, a new building, a new exhibit. And there's the Federal Center, the Oak Hill Cemetery. Many of you that went on our tour went there as well. The Sanitarium building, the Health Food Company building, the homes of Sidney Brownsberger, Frank Belden, W.W. Prescott, O.A. Olson, Uriah, and Harriet Smith. 19th century pioneers, those houses are still there. Bedford, Michigan, Richard Godsmark House. Anybody remember Richard Godsmark? He donated 2 oxen to get the publishing work started here in Michigan. The names of the oxen were Buck and Bright. And he loved to stop by the Review and Herald office in Battle Creek and listen to those presses humming. And he'd say, "Oh, Buck and Bright, they're pulling away. They're pulling away." So the Godsmark House, or the 2 oxen, Buck and Bright. Of course, down there at Berrien Springs, we've got a small university. You may have heard of it. And the Center for Adventist Research has some wonderful exhibits, including a lot of artifacts from the pioneers themselves. We've got a biology museum with a prehistoric mastodon that was actually dug up in a nearby field in Michigan. Mastodon skeleton. 1830 log cabin right there in Berrien Springs, the oldest log cabin in Michigan, right there. 1839 courthouse, the oldest courthouse in Michigan, right there. 19th century jail, sheriff's office, and museum. And for those of you that are into fishing, we've got a fish ladder around the dam in Berrien Springs where you can watch the 4-foot coho and king salmon make their way up the fish ladder. And that is exciting to see. Huge fish. Burlington, Michigan. Well, we've got Elliot J. Wagner's grave in Burlington, Michigan, because that's where he grew up. And the Burlington SDA Church, of course, is there. You've all been to Cedar Lake, Great Lakes Adventist Academy, our oldest academy, Cedar Lake, 1898. Dowagiac, the Old Rugged Cross Church. You ever sung that hymn? The Old Rugged Cross? That's where it was first performed. First performed. And that church is beautifully restored. No, it's close. You go out Pokagon Road, yes. You go out Pokagon Road, but I think it's closer to Dowagiac on the map. Grand Ledge, of course. Irving Guilford's grave is there. Now, he's William Miller's nephew that brought him the call to preach in 1831 and kind of started Miller on his preaching career. The next one, alphabetically speaking, I suppose, would be Grand Rapids, but I presume you've all been there. You've all been to the Gerald R. Ford Museum and Presidential Library. Jesse suggested that, and I thought, well, you know, the people up in Holland have probably already been there. It's only, 30 minutes, 40 minutes drive from your house here. But maybe the ones down in Anderson will want to see that. Grayling, of course, you've all been to Camp Au Sable up there. It might be a place that we could rest our heads and feast. Well, we're going to some of the other places in the area. Greenville, James and Ellen White's rural retreat home, 1867-68. The house is still there. Pardon? It's privately owned, yeah. Holly, that was the headquarters of the East Michigan Conference, 1902 to 31. Campus of Adelphian Academy, established 1904. There's still an Adventist elementary school there, of course, even though the academy is closed down. Jackson, Michigan. They don't have their original Adventist church there, but they do have their 1891 church. That was the second one they built. Also the site of Dan and Abigail Palmer's home. And the Palmer's unique gravestone, which is in the Catholic section of the library, has an open Bible on top. And on the Bible, it references the seventh-day Sabbath. So even in the Catholic section of the cemetery, the Palmers continue their witness. And for those of you who aren't on the CHIP program, there's Loudon Jackson's famous ice cream parlor, and that is sinfully delicious. The rest of you, of course, could take a walk in the park nearby, but those that would like to try to devour a Dare to Be Great, which is about a gallon of ice cream and whipped cream and cherries and nuts and all of that good stuff. I tried it once with 4 of my 9th and 10th grade boys, and we got a Dare to Be Great down to 1 pint, and none of us wanted to take another bite. Yeah, that was unhealthy, but I was 25. See, I had a lot to learn. I was 25. A Dare to Be Great at Loudon Jackson's. It's famous. The Cascade Park. This is one of the old-fashioned 1920s, 1930s hillside cascades. They put lights on the water and play music, and it is just a marvelous experience. One of my favorites is Red Sails in the Sunset with red lights on the water. Oh, it's gorgeous. Juddville, the birthplace of the MV Society, with the 2 boys, right? Luther Warren, 13 years old. Harry Fenner, what was he, 17, I think? The site of the Adventist church there as well. Kalamazoo, Alonzo T. Jones' grave. Isaac D. Van Horn's grave there. Van Horn was one of our pioneer missionaries to Washington and Oregon when they were territories, not yet states. The Mackinac Straits. All of you been up to Mackinac? Yes? No? A few? All right. There's the Mackinac Bridge. Some of you may have walked across that on Labor Day. Fort Michilimackinac with reenactors firing their guns and setting off 18th century cannon. There's the Grand Hotel, the last of the super elegant, expensive. I mean, gentlemen, if you want to do something really special for your 25th, 30th, 35th, 40th, 50th wedding anniversary, book a room at the Grand Hotel, okay? The famous Mackinac fudge and ice cream. Now, those of you on the CHIP program will have to take a walk in the park there. You can't have the fudge and the ice cream. The Sioux Locks, about an hour away, with ocean-going ships going through the locks. That's kind of exciting for me because I grew up in Waterloo, New York, where they had canal locks in the town. Spectacular views of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior up there as well. Flip the page over, Monterey. The Monterey Seventh-day Adventist Church is still standing, built by Joseph Bates in the 1860s. Bates' home is still there that he built in 1860. And the gravestone of Joseph and Prudy Bates and George T. Lay in what's called Tunk Lake Road or Poplar Hill Cemetery. You've seen the grave of the 2 co-founders, James and Ellen White, but you need to go to Monterey to see the grave of the 3rd church co-founder, Joseph Bates and his wife. Niles, Michigan, not too far from Berrien Springs, the Museum of American Indian Life. Fascinating. Fascinating. A lot of original 19th century Indian artifacts there. Fort St. Joseph as well. Artifacts of Fort St. Joseph. You know, Niles advertises itself as the city of 4 flags because at one time or another, the British flag, the French flag, The Spanish flag for one day and the American flag have flown over Niles. The city of four flags. Yes. The whose? Okay. I think the only way we would put that on our tour, though, is if you were playing the organ. We would go there then. All right. The Otsego Seventh Adventist Church. Dudley N. Camwright's grave is there. This is the site of the Aaron Hilliard home, which is still standing. That's where Ellen White had her 1863 health reform vision. The Aaron Hilliard home. It's privately owned, and they don't really like Adventists. So all pictures would have to be taken from the window of the bus as we slowly go by, okay? We don't want to cause a major upset there. Parkville, the Parkville Seventh Adventist Church, built in 1861, the site of Ellen White's famous Civil War vision, January of 1861. Parkville Seventh Adventist Church. Petoskey, the site of Hannah More's grave. That's quite a story in itself. The beautiful Leelanau Peninsula. The famous Petoskey stones. They make them into jewelry. Beautiful Petoskey stones. The Frankfurt Seventh Adventist Church, also founded by Luther Warren, his wife Belle, 1891. Ellen White had a summer home up there in 1890 and 91, still standing. Potterville, the John Carmen home, with a special added room for James and Ellen White. And they are still Seventh-day Adventists. It's been in Carmen Seventh-day Adventist hands for 150 years. But, you know, just like that couple in the Bible created an extra upper room for Elijah to stay in. That's what the Carmen family did for James and Ellen White, anytime they wanted to get away. Of course, South Bend, not too far south of us in Berrien Springs, University of Notre Dame campus, the Studebaker Museum. Those of you that like old cars, some of you remember the Studebakers. They have them all, old cars there. A historical museum as well attached. Tippecanoe Place, that's the former Studebaker family home, multi-millionaire, 9 stories. I think 3 or 4 of them are underground stories. Very fine restaurant. I've been there many times with classes of mine for Sunday brunch. Oh, it's sinfully delicious. Those of you on the CHIP program will not enjoy it quite as much. But, to have an omelet custom made for you. 12 different ingredients. Marvelous. Potawatomi Zoo is there for those of you into zoo animals. St. Joseph. Well, there's Kilwin's famous waffle cones and fudge. Those of you on the CHIP program will have to skip that stop. But I'll tell you, a waffle cone is just super delicious. And there's about 3 dozen different... Harold, we want to have people have a good taste in their mouth after our tours. What's that? Yeah, do I hear an amen? Curious Kids Museum, if there are any little kids along. There's a 100-year-old carousel. Remember the old carousels? Many of them made in Germany with the old exotic animals bobbing up and down. They have one there. You can actually take a selfie of yourself riding on a 100-year-old carousel. Silver Beach swimming for those that would like to get into the water. Stevensville, the Cook Energy Center, nuclear power plant, and its exhibits. And, of course, Wright Seventh-day Adventist Church, built in 1872, the site of the first official Seventh-day Adventist camp meeting in 1868 in Wright, Michigan. It's still an open field area today. So, like we did with last year's tour, we're combining some American history and some Adventist history with this tour. And as I said a moment ago, we won't be able to see all 70 of these places, but we will select from them a representative sampling for probably a 6-day tour. And this time, if we follow Jesse's plan of the bus leaving Anderson, Indiana, and going straight up to Petoskey, probably about an 8-hour day instead of what we had last year, a 16-hour day. That was exhausting. And if I can get enough people signed up from Holland, I'm going to use my Irish persuasion skills to persuade Jesse and Susan to come to Holland and pick you guys up. That would save you that 4-hour drive down to Anderson. But if you look at the map, the shortest distance between 2 points from Anderson, Indiana to Petoskey is not 31. It's I-69, straight up through Lansing. So we're going to have to get, I'd say, a good representation, maybe 8 or 10. I'm counting on my 6 from last year, hoping to add Jim and Marilyn, hoping to add Jim and his wife over here, hoping to add Harold and his wife, because it's been a long time since Harold's been on an Adventist history tour. We can get maybe 8 to 10 people from here. Then I can persuade Jesse, look, you got about 1/3 of your group in Holland. So let's come up, 31, stop here at the church. You could park your cars in the parking lot here at church, board the bus, and then head north from here on up to Petoskey. We're looking at the same second week of September that we did the last 2 tours. The reason for it, from Jesse and Susan's point of view, is because they're running a farm. And they've got to get done with all of the fruit and vegetables before they can leave, because their livelihood is selling fruit and vegetables. The only thing left for them in October are things like pumpkins and squash, and they do a huge multi-acre maize that they actually carve out of their cornfield. And people come from miles and miles to go through that maze. They send up a drone and take a picture of it. Last year, it was the maze in the shape of the state of Indiana, because it was the centennial of the state of Indiana. So they did a huge maze with the borderline being the borders of Indiana. I don't know what they'll do this year. But kids and parents, somewhere in that second week range. Yeah, probably Sunday through Friday. So, you could attend church here the Sabbath before, and you can be back in time for church the Sabbath after if you've got deacon duties or deaconess, elder, what have you. We won't be taking you away from your local church duties. And the weather will be cooler, and maybe up north we'll see some color, some of that wonderful leaf color. So we're extending this up through 93, okay, age 93, yeah, Leonard, we want to get you in on this too, right, up through age 93. Just got back from a 150-mile bicycle ride. I think he's fit, okay. More than some of the rest of us. Any questions at this point? This is basically an information type meeting. I want you to think about it. I want you to pray about it. Start setting the money aside, okay? Did you have a great time, despite the leaky windows? We actually solved a serious bus suspension problem with 2 paper clips and what was the other thing? Crossbow, string, the crossbow string. We found a string to a crossbow in the parking lot, didn't we? And I supplied 2 paper clips, and that solved the problem until we could get back to Anderson, Indiana. It was fun. These are the adventures we remember. But we'll be having a chartered coach this time. There is a wealthy member of the Anderson, Indiana Church who always goes on these tours. He would not appreciate my mentioning his name, but he is, shall I say, sponsoring this chartered coach. He has tried his best to fix the church bus, and his conclusion is it's a design flaw in the bus itself that caused all that leakage. It's not something he can patch or repair. So he's putting up the money so that you don't have to pay extra for a chartered coach from Indianapolis, which will have all the amenities: bathroom, Wi-Fi, PA system, heat and air conditioning, comfortable seats, etc. But as various ones have said, the fellowship is sweet. I mean, we start every morning with worship. There is a worship that begins the day, and then I give lectures on the bus before we arrive at the site so that we don't tie you up once we get to the historic site. You can get off the bus, take your pictures, tour the area, and so we try to be as efficient as possible, and the food is very good, isn't it? I mean, Susan Landis is responsible for that. She'll accommodate the lacto-ovo vegetarians and the vegans as well. Susan and Jesse are vegans themselves. Yeah. Oh, man. Sweet, sweet, sweet. So you will not go hungry. I think I gained a couple of pounds. Okay. Good food, clean rooms, economy motel rooms, comfortable bus. The weather's up to the good Lord. We did have some rain last year, but we had some sunshine as well. The weather is in his hands. No questions at this point? When I come back, you say it's in October. I forgot to check the date. October 12th. Okay. Columbus Day. We'll take some more questions from you and maybe ask for a show of hands. I know the Slickers couldn't be here tonight. They told me they were away. And so I'm counting on them. They're part of my 6-person team from last year. And I'd like to add another 4, okay? And then I can go to Jesse on hands and knees, and I say, I know it's quicker to go through Lansing, but we've got these 10 people, a third of our group in Holland. So let's go to Holland first and save them the 4-hour, 8 hours round trip going down to Anderson. Okay. All right, think about it, pray about it. This is something you probably will do just once in your life. All right.
Dr. Strayer, thanks once again for sharing your knowledge with us. Pleasure to have you always. On the tour. Okay. Refresher on what's coming up. On a Friday evening, October 4. Production services required. Welcome you. The next day, Mark Anthony will special best person talking after. Then Dr. Strayer will return for 12 on the some of us travel. That's what's coming up in October. October 5, October 12. One, be with those who are sick, Lord.